When Saipan fell in July 1944, Japan's war leaders didn't argue, they panicked. For the first time, Tokyo realized the Pacific Wall was collapsing, inch by inch, toward the emperor himself. Inside dim war rooms, generals whispered a single truth Japan had never dared admit: we are losing the war. Early 1944. The Pacific Ocean, once Japan's proud defensive moat, has become a chain of burning, shattered islands. From Tarawa in the Gilberts to Kwajalein and Eniwetok in the Marshalls, the American island-hopping campaign has carved a brutal path westward. Every defeat pushes Japan's defensive perimeter closer to the home islands. Every loss reveals a military machine straining under the weight of its own overreach. Ahead lies the Marianas, and at their center, the island Japan believes must never fall. Saipan. A narrow, crescent-shaped island just 13 miles long, Saipan sits nearly 1,500 miles from Tokyo. But in the minds of Japan's senior planners, that distance did not represent safety. It represented the last line of survival. The Imperial General Staff described the Marianas as Japan's inner rampart, and Saipan specifically as an unsinkable aircraft carrier guarding the skies over the home islands. Whoever controlled Saipan controlled the future of the war. The Japanese High Command knew exactly what American long-range bombers were capable of. They had watched the new B-29 Superfortresses rise in the United States, aircraft with the range to strike Tokyo itself. If the Americans captured Saipan, they could build airfields on its flat southern plains, and Japan's capital would be within reach for the first time in history. To defend this island, Japan deployed more than 30,000 men, veterans of the 43rd Division, units of the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, elite naval infantry from the 1st and 3rd Special Naval Landing Forces, and thousands of armed militia and labor units made up of Okinawan and local conscripted civilians. Their bodies would form the shield. The terrain would form the sword. Saipan's geography favored the defenders. Steep coral ridges, cane fields that masked movement, caves carved into ancient volcanic cliffs, and inland high ground that created natural defensive belts. Japanese engineers spent months reinforcing bunkers, spider hole networks, and artillery sites concealed in the island's interior. Radio messages to Tokyo repeated a single theme: Saipan is impenetrable. Morale was reinforced by propaganda insisting that American forces feared the spirit attacks and suicidal determination of Japanese troops, the supposedly irresistible force of the Yamato-damashii, the Japanese warrior soul. Many soldiers believed it. Many civilians, tragically, believed it too. In Tokyo, wartime cabinet meetings hammered this point with growing desperation. Naval Minister Shigetaro Shimada, Army Chief of Staff Hajime Sugiyama, and Prime Minister Hideki Tojo all heard the same warning from their strategists. The Marianas cannot fall. If they do, Japan is finished. The stakes were clear. Lose Saipan, and the enemy gains a base from which American bombers can reach the Emperor's palace. That fear drove Japan to declare that the coming battle must be a decisive victory. A battle that would halt the American advance and restore confidence in Japan's faltering Pacific Empire. But across the ocean, the United States had already made its decision. Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands, would begin with Saipan. The date was set, June 15, 1944. Thousands of Marines from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions prepared for the assault, backed by the might of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. As the American landing craft began to form their assault waves offshore, Japanese commanders still believed Saipan would hold. They still believed the island could not fall. Within weeks, Saipan would expose fatal truths about Japan's war machine, truths Tokyo was not yet ready to face. Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea in a blaze of orange fire, revealing an armada so vast it seemed to reshape the horizon. More than 300 U.S. Navy vessels, battleships, cruisers, carriers, destroyers, and troop transports, formed a steel ring around Saipan, each preparing to unleash the greatest amphibious assault yet seen in the Pacific War. At 08:40 a.m., June 15, 1944, the first waves of U.S. Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions pushed toward the beaches under a storm of Japanese artillery. The sea itself convulsed. Mortar rounds threw columns of water skyward as landing craft zigzagged toward shore, packed with Marines bracing for the tortured seconds before the ramps dropped. Offshore, battleships like USS Tennessee and USS California pounded enemy positions, but the Japanese fortifications, deeply dug, expertly camouflaged, remained lethal. Machine gun nests opened up the moment the first Marines hit the reefs. Men were cut down as they waded chest-deep toward the sand. The beachhead was chaos. Sand-clogged rifles, flames from burning oil tanks rolled across the shoreline, and bodies floated back with the tide. Amid the smoke, Japanese officers inside Saipan's underground network of caves and bunkers hammered out the first desperate messages to Tokyo. Communications units relayed fragmented updates, each one more alarming than the last. Enemy forces overwhelming. Outer defenses breached in several sectors. Ammunition exhausted, unable to resupply. These were not the measured assessments Tokyo was accustomed to. These were cries from a garrison collapsing far sooner than expected. In the Japanese capital, the atmosphere inside the military high command shifted from routine reports to raw panic. Prime Minister and War Minister General Hideki Tojo, leading the army, and Admiral Somu Toyoda, Chief of the Naval General Staff, received the dispatches almost simultaneously. Each man understood the implication instantly, and each recognized something else. The other service had been misleading the government for months. The army had insisted Saipan was impregnable, boasting nearly 30,000 troops and fortified ridgelines. The Navy, meanwhile, had promised that its carrier forces would keep American fleets far from the Marianas. But reality was now burning on Tojo's desk in the form of frantic radio traffic. The bureaucratic chaos erupted immediately. Army officers blamed the Navy's shattered air groups for failing to intercept the American approach. Navy staff countered that the Army had grossly exaggerated the island's defensive strength and ignored repeated warnings about inadequate supplies, outdated artillery, and low morale among the garrison. As more messages arrived, the tone grew even more dire. Request immediate reinforcement. Unable to hold current line. We will resist, but situation critical. Yet the orders Tokyo radiated back were rigid, unbending, almost ritualistic. Hold at all costs. Defend Saipan to the last man. The command reflected an entrenched doctrine, gyokusai, the belief that an honorable force should shatter like a jade jewel rather than surrender. But inside the concrete rooms beneath Tokyo, even the officers who invoked it felt their confidence cracking. Then, on June 25, one report cut through the noise like a blade. The fall of the Mount Tapochau ridgeline, Saipan's central high ground. Control of Tapochau meant the Americans dominated the island's core. Japanese forces were now split, isolated, and exposed. When the update reached Tojo, witnesses recorded that his reaction was immediate and unmistakable, a moment of visible shock, rare for the man who had built his reputation on iron resolve. But the worst message was still to come. Near midnight, Tokyo received a final transmission from Saipan's battered headquarters. We will conduct the final attack at dawn. To any Japanese officer, the meaning was unmistakable. It was the traditional signal of annihilation, the last charge. The garrison was finished. Yet even faced with this certainty, Tokyo's high command refused to accept the truth. The collapse of Saipan meant something far larger than the loss of an island. It meant the homeland itself was now within reach of American bombers, and that reality was one the generals were not yet ready to confront. June 7, 1944 dawned over Saipan, and with it came the final, desperate act of a garrison that had been ground down for weeks. In the pre-dawn darkness, more than 3,000 Japanese soldiers, many wounded, some on crutches, others unarmed medics and doctors, assembled along the shattered front lines. They had survived artillery barrages, naval bombardments, and relentless infantry assaults. Now they prepared for a single cataclysmic gesture, a banzai charge, the largest of the Pacific War. The terrain was scarred beyond recognition. Craters from naval shells and bombs pocked the beaches and hills. Mount Tapochau, the island's central ridge, had already fallen, giving U.S. Marines commanding fields of fire across the interior. Yet the Japanese troops surged forward, driven by gyokusai, the doctrine of honorable annihilation, shouting their war cries in unison. The human wave was staggering. Men in tattered uniforms, bloodied and exhausted, lunged toward entrenched American positions, rifles and swords in hand, fueled by a mixture of desperation, obedience, and the hope of dying with honor. For the Marines, it was chaos incarnate. Machine guns mowed down wave after wave, and yet for hours the Japanese pressed on. Officers recorded in after-action reports that at several points, entire American defensive lines appeared to falter under the sheer momentum of the charge. Bodies collided with barbed wire, sand, and coral, some still clutching weapons in death. By dawn, the front lines were nearly obliterated, a cratered tableau of carnage and courage, but the human tide finally ceased. Amid the rubble, the Japanese command structure had disintegrated. Survivors transmitted their final messages back to Tokyo. Positions lost. Imperial banner destroyed. These messages carried the weight of a nation's failure, a numerical confirmation of the collapse that no bureaucracy could mask. In Saipan's underground command posts, the most senior officers confronted their fate. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, architect of Pearl Harbor's attack, and Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commander of the island's garrison, performed ritual seppuku, taking their lives rather than face capture. Their deaths were reported by survivors, yet Tokyo still clung to hope, however faint. It was not until the final coded transmission reached the Japanese high command that reality fully sank in. In the cabinet room, the usually rigid officers and bureaucrats fell silent. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had rarely admitted failure, now spoke words that would never again leave official record lightly. "We have miscalculated the enemy's strength." The message was more than an admission, it was a psychological rupture. For years, Japanese propaganda had built a myth of invincibility, portraying the homeland and its island fortresses as unassailable. Now, Saipan's fall shattered that illusion. U.S. B-29 bombers, stationed in the captured Marianas, were suddenly within striking distance of Tokyo itself, a fact that left the emperor's advisors noting that he grew pale during the briefing. Panic rippled beyond military channels. Civilians began evacuating Tokyo neighborhoods, streets jammed with anxious families, and rumors of impending air raids reached the halls of the Diet, amplifying fear and uncertainty. The human cost on Saipan alone was staggering. Of the 30,000 Japanese troops, more than 24,000 lay dead. American casualties numbered over 3,400, but the scale of the Japanese banzai charge and the willingness to fight to annihilation left a deep impression on the Marines who survived. It was both a tactical victory and a sobering lesson in the ferocity of Japanese military culture. In Tokyo, the political ramifications now demanded attention. The cabinet faced an unprecedented crisis. Saipan was gone, the Marianas lost, and the myth of invulnerability shattered. All eyes turned to Tojo. Should he remain in power after this catastrophic miscalculation? That question hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable, as the city braced itself for the consequences that the fall of a single island would ripple across an empire. Saipan was no longer just a battlefield. It had become the psychological pivot point of the Pacific War, signaling a new phase in which Japan's strategic defenses could be breached, and the war could be brought to its very heart. The night was over, but the empire's night had only just begun. The fall of Saipan was more than a military defeat. It was a political earthquake that reverberated through the corridors of Tokyo's highest offices. Inside the imperial palace and the cabinet war room, tension reached a boiling point. Army ministers accused the Navy of betrayal, claiming that carrier forces had failed to intercept the U.S. invasion fleet. Navy officers fired back, calling the Army's estimates fantasy planning, arguing that their troop deployments were unrealistic and doomed from the start. For the first time since the war began, whispers of defeat entered the open. Saipan's loss triggered the most severe crisis in Japan's leadership since the Manchurian Incident of 1931. Private audiences with Emperor Hirohito reveal a man visibly unsettled, questioning whether the existing war leadership retained the competence to protect the homeland. Advisors reported that he paused in silence, staring at maps and intelligence reports before asking bluntly, could Japan still be defended? Inside Tojo's cabinet, the debate bordered on chaos. Some ministers, long constrained by loyalty and protocol, began pushing for surrender talks, the idea almost unthinkable only weeks before. Others insisted on preparing a decisive battle on the home islands, calling for kamikaze strategies, coastal fortifications, and an all-or-nothing stand to preserve honor. Papers were pushed across polished tables. Memos circulated with the grim notation that Japan's industrial output was collapsing. Aircraft production lagged, fuel reserves dwindled, and training programs had failed to produce adequately prepared pilots or infantrymen. The psychological strain inside the war room was immediate and raw. Several senior officers reportedly wept openly, unable to reconcile the myth of invincibility with the reality of American air power now within range of Tokyo. Others shouted, their voices cracking, that Japan would soon be burned from the sky if the B-29s were allowed to operate unchecked from the Marianas. These were men who had built careers on discipline and honor, now unraveling under the weight of strategic failure. By July 18, 1944, the strain proved unsustainable. Hideki Tojo, who had been prime minister, army minister, and symbol of wartime authority, resigned. His departure did not stabilize the situation. It fractured the war leadership into competing factions, each advocating a different path forward, some seeking negotiation, others demanding martyrdom, others still clinging to the hope of miraculous counterattacks. The institutional coherence of Japan's military government was shattered. What remained was a war effort beset by indecision. Supplies were insufficient, command structures fragmented, and morale at its nadir. The cabinet that would form in Tojo's wake inherited not just a political vacuum, but a strategic reality that was already slipping beyond Japan's control. Airfields were now in American hands, naval dominance was eroding, and the myth of invincibility that had long shielded the public from despair had been brutally stripped away by the islands of the Marianas. The fall of Saipan was no longer merely a loss on the battlefield. It had become a mirror, reflecting the vulnerabilities of an empire unprepared for the relentless industrial and strategic power of the United States. And in the shadows of the imperial palace, as ministers whispered and advisors fretted, the war that had once seemed winnable now teetered on the edge of inevitable catastrophe. The capture of Saipan in July 1944 marked more than a tactical victory for the United States. It fundamentally reshaped the Pacific War. Within months, B-29 Superfortresses were stationed on the newly secured Marianas, capable of reaching the heart of Japan. The first raids began with precision bombing, targeting industrial centers in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, laying the groundwork for the firebombings that would devastate entire cities and claim hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. For those in Japan, the phrase "Saipan decided everything" was more than rhetoric. It was a whispered acknowledgement of a grim strategic truth. Diaries of bureaucrats and generals, alongside post-war interrogations, reveal that the Japanese high command understood, almost immediately, that the empire's war effort had crossed a point of no return. The fall of the Marianas meant loss of strategic depth, exposing the home islands to the full weight of American industrial and aerial power. The careful balance between Army and Navy, already strained by rivalry and mutual blame during Saipan's defense, was now irrevocably broken. Coordination between services had collapsed, leaving Japan's defensive perimeter in disarray. Morale among Japan's military and civilian leadership plummeted. Letters from officers stranded on islands like Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu describe exhaustion and despair. In Tokyo, ministers debated in hushed tones, aware that continuing the war was no longer a question of strategy. It had become a question of survival. The shock of Saipan forced the leadership to confront what until then had been suppressed. The war was unwinnable. Yet the emotional resonance of Saipan went beyond strategy. It was the moment Japan's leaders first glimpsed the end, not in 1945, but in mid-1944, long before the first atomic bomb or the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. Civilians sensed it too. Rumors of air raids and evacuations swept through cities, feeding a quiet, pervasive anxiety. For the ordinary Japanese, the name Saipan became synonymous with loss, fear, and the looming shadow of defeat. Ironically, while Japanese soldiers continued dying on distant Pacific islands, many leaders in Tokyo were already contemplating negotiated settlements, seeking ways to preserve some measure of honor and autonomy in the face of inevitable defeat. It was a war still raging across the ocean, but for those in the imperial palace and war ministry, the outcome was already clear. Saipan did not end the war, but it shattered the illusion that Japan could win it. The military doctrine, propaganda, and myth of invincibility that had sustained the empire through years of conquest were irreparably broken. From that moment on, every Japanese leader knew the same stark truth. The empire's countdown had begun, and no strategy, no valor, could reverse the course that the loss of Saipan had irrevocably set in motion.